Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Barbara Oakley, who is a distinguished professor, engineer, and globally recognized expert in the fields of learning and neuroscience. She is best known for her groundbreaking work on understanding how people learn and for developing practical strategies to improve learning effectiveness. Barbara's journey is nothing short of inspiring. For many of us, the idea of not being a good learner or struggling with certain subjects feels like a permanent label. But Barbara's story is going to challenge that belief. She went from believing she was terrible at math, a subject she once avoided, to becoming an expert in it and a celebrated professor of engineering. How does someone make such a remarkable transformation? That's exactly what we're going to dive into today. Barbara's journey exemplifies the power of embracing a growth mindset and updating outdated learning strategies. As she has said before, many of us are still operating with the same tools and habits we developed in school, strategies that can leave us feeling stuck and convinced we can't learn something new. So let's jump right in. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. You have such an inspiring backstory because I think a lot of people, and you and I talked about this before we started recording, haven't updated their learning strategies prior or after they got out of school. So they're operating with outdated strategies, and it makes them feel like they're not a good learner and they can't learn something new. And your journey from struggling with math to becoming an expert in it is incredibly inspiring. Can you share your backstory and some of those pivotal moments that led to that transformation?
So I always thought I was terrible at math, mostly because I was terrible at math. And so I enlisted in the Army right out of high school and went to the Defense Language Institute to learn a language. I picked the Russian language more or less at random and learned how to learn a language. I eventually ended up working as a Russian translator on board Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and of course that's when you really learn. But if you're learning Russian, you're doing it while you're drinking as well. So when I have a little bit of wine, the Russian comes back quite well. But the reality is that when I got out of the military at age 26, I realized that I was not getting the kind of job offers in interesting areas that I wanted to work in. And I thought, well, math is kind of like a language. And I end up taking pride in the fact that I'm open to new adventures. Why don't I see if I can take a new adventure of the mind and see if I can learn in math and science? And I I started at the lowest possible level of remedial high school algebra, but I used the same techniques I had used to learn a language. I used practice and repetition. I internalized key ideas I was learning about. I still remember one time this guy, I was studying chemistry really hard, and this guy took my calculator from me. It was one of those newfangled programmable calculators. And he cleared it and he gives it back to me. It was like right before the test, he clears it and gives it back to me with this big kind of grin on his face, like, I'll show you, you've got all this stuff programmed in. And of course, you won't do very well now. But I had it programmed into my mind how to excel on the test. So it was like, oh, well, thank you. I got the calculator back and used it for the trivial calculations. But I had learned how to internalize and work with. So I was a slower learner, but when I learned something, I learned it really well. And that was really how I learned a language, and it was how I could become successful in learning in math and science. So now, who knew? I'm actually a distinguished professor of engineering, and I love math and science, which is a very long way from where I began many years before.
Well, your personal journey is inspiring, and I'm sure you had some difficult obstacles to overcome. How did you maintain motivation and focus when the path ahead was daunting?
Learn to grow comfortable with the feeling of being uncomfortable. There were so many times I'm like, why am I doing this? Oh, wait a minute. I just bombed this test. How am I going to move forward on this? I'm not sure I can really learn this stuff, but just trudging ahead anyway. It's not like you have to be persistent at every single thing in life that you choose to be persistent at. I met people, for example, who had gone to the Defense Language Institute and they really just could not learn a language. It was whatever was going on, they really, really struggled with it. And they gave it a good college try, so to speak, over a number of months. It wasn't for them. So this can happen, but for me, I worked really hard and I tried to work really smart. If I made mistakes and didn't do well on a test, I would go back and look at what some of my study techniques were to see why I wasn't being successful. And I think sometimes for those students who were not successful, the real challenge is they hadn't been taught how to learn. And it's not like I was taught how to learn. I mean, I had to kind of do a lot of figuring out for myself. But at the same time, I did get lucky in that I at least had a mindset where I kind of thought, well, if if I'm not doing well, let's go back and relook at how I was studying. I think for some people, they didn't have that mindset. If they didn't do well, they didn't go revisit to see where they went wrong. They just kind of said, "Well, I don't really have what it takes to be successful." And that may not have been true, but all of this just goes back and I think presents sort of an indictment on the educational system that they don't teach kids how to learn effectively. And there's so much we know now about how people can do better in their learning.
One of your books, you talk about a mind shift. Love for you to define that and why embracing this kind of shift is so crucial for fostering personal growth to keep you learning throughout your life.
I think something that is really valuable is to realize that whatever your background is, it can be helpful for you in the future, no matter what you're doing. So, for example, I know one young man who was a really good guitar player. I mean, we're talking world class. He was going to Juilliard. He was really amazing. He was playing for children who had cancer. And then he began to realize that, it was maybe something of a calling for him to actually become a doctor and help children through becoming a doctor, not simply through playing music, which is a really great thing to do, but also by learning medicine. And all his friends were like, "You're nuts. You're just nuts. You're at the top of your field. You really know this. And what do you know about medicine? You know nothing. You know no chemistry." In fact, when he took his last high school chemistry class and kind of flunked it, but he barely passed with a C, and then he burned his papers. He was just so happy to never have to look at it again. But he began studying medicine. And do you know that one of the ways that his past has helped him is he is able to listen to the heart and pick up rhythms that the other medical school students couldn't hear, couldn't because he had that really well-developed ear from his previous life as a musician rather than a medical doctor. So it's amazing sometimes that whatever you might have been in the past. Let's say you are an Uber driver and you start to go into programming. You think, oh, well, an Uber driver, that's not going to help me at all. It helps a lot because a lot of programmers find it difficult to speak easily with, with people. But if you are a good Uber driver, you know how to communicate well with others. And that's a valuable skill amongst many other skills that you can learn. So I think mind shift is realizing that you can make major changes in what you think you can do and that your past is not baggage. It can actually be a real advantage.
I love that insight. And sometimes we are our biggest obstacles, and self awareness is really often that key to transformation. How do self monitoring practices help people identify and address their thoughts or habits that might be holding them back?
Self monitoring can take place in many different ways. And how it works is a bit of mystery. So, for example, it's been found that if you simply journal what's going on in your life, you write about it. So let's say you have to experience a painful injection over a number of days. If you write about it and the experience of getting that injection, somehow it helps the brain to grapple with it so that you can handle these negative experiences more effectively. Metacognition can mean backing off and looking objectively at what you might have done better, but it can also mean sort of letting, like writing things out, journaling things, and letting your subconscious begin to make sense in a way that can and have a positive outcome for you, even if you're not really consciously aware of the metacognitive processes that have unfolded.
Those are good insights and a great practical tool to use because that self awareness is such a key piece of changing your mindset that you are a good learner, that you're just operating possibly with outdated strategies. Another common issue I see with people trying to learn, especially as adult learners, is that the world is full of comparisons and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. There's always going to be someone out there that's better than you at something. How can people embrace this truth without feeling discouraged and instead focus on their own growth?
Sometimes I think the best way to do it is to kind of look at yourself as if you are standing behind you and you're looking at yourself from afar, and then just develop a habit of laughing at yourself when you catch yourself being jealous or envious or just kind of having foolish human feelings about different things that you know somehow are not really the best feelings to have. But if you can just step back and learn to laugh at yourself about these kinds of things, it can be really helpful. And ultimately, isn't the world a better place when we have lots of talented people who some of whom are inevitably going to be more talented than you, but it really does help to make the world a better place overall.
I would agree. It's difficult to do, but it's transformational if you can do it and just really rely on progress that you've made from the past self versus saying I'm better than so and so because that really that the world is full of comparisons and your unique gifts are different from someone else's and it's really hard to compare the two. Let's move into just our brains and how capable they are of incredible feats of learning that we really don't realize. And I love how you state the difference between a focused and diffused mode of thinking. And how can we harness both of these to supercharge our ability to learn?
I'll give a very specific example. We are often told start with the easiest problem on a test and then work towards the more difficult problems because that will help you, get the easiest ones done. That'll give you confidence and so forth. But that actually is good advice only if you have not studied at all. Then you want to take whatever simple, easy points you want, you can have. But a very good strategy is to look over a test when you first get it and then pick out the hardest problem. Work on it only for a couple minutes until you start to feel that internal, no, I don't know what to do next. And that's usually, only about 2 minutes into the problem. Then pull yourself off and go to an easy problem. Work on that. While you are focused on that easier problem, you are actually using a different part of your brain, right? So you're like you change your focus. You're using a somewhat slightly different part of your brain. And in the meantime, there's this much more wide-ranging, what is called the default mode network that is pinging around in the background. As soon as you take your focus off that first difficult problem, that turns on the default mode's network ability to ping around and work in the background on that hard problem. So you're working away, focusing on the easy problem. In the background, your brain is working away on that more difficult problem. Later in the test, when you return to the hard problem, you'll find you can suddenly make progress on it. So that's taking very clever advantage of these two different modes, your focus mode, that's and then this much more broad mind wandering default mode network that I call the diffuse mode. So if you use both of these modes, there is a way to actually use them both at the same time, but just not on the same problem.
When I think with training and development and when you're learning something, it's, that focus mode is you're actively learning, you're trying to assimilate the information, but you need the breaks. And I don't think people realize this, or this gets enough talked about, is having the breaks after a certain learning period, whether you're using the Pomodoro method, but having that time where you're just not focused on anything. If you're studying, sitting down, you're going for a walk, you're in nature, you're getting physically active. You mentioned exercise is a great way for the diffuse mode, but doing something that's completely different so your body has that break so it can consolidate the information in the background. Your diffuse mode is still working, providing you those insights and storing it from working memory into long-term memory, which a lot of times people think that they have something in long-term memory, right? And it's really just in their working memory.
That's right. So, you ping back and forth when you're learning. You can't be in both modes at the same time on the same topic unless you're, like taking some mushrooms. And I'm not recommending taking mushrooms, but we often don't realize that, we think that we kind of figure things out really quickly because we all know somebody, for example, who can figure out like a math problem really quickly. And then when we can't do it, we think either A, we're kind of stupid, or B, maybe math is just not for me. But there's actually some people are just slower in putting things together. Their mind is making connections in the background, but this can mean that they actually are learning the information more deeply. Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize winner, said he was a terribly slow learner. And be embarrassed when he was studying economics with his friends who were like, pooh, they could just get it all instantly. But the fact that he was so slow is why he felt that he won the Nobel Prize, because his slow way of figuring things out meant that, where his friends would just jump right over something and assume it's true. He could not do that. And he would struggle. And that's where he would find that there'd been mistakes in some of the previous ways of looking things. And that's, of course, how he won the Nobel Prize.
Well, and that's a great distinction because you distinguish those two types of brains. One has a race car brain, higher mental capacity, greater working memory. And then that's distinguished or contrasted against the hiker brain, which has
Yes.
it's a slower brain, like you just mentioned, that has slower processing speeds, possibly, maybe a smaller working memory capacity.
So, like, I have a very small working memory capacity. People will ask me sometimes when I'm giving a presentation, they'll go, I have 3 questions for you. And I'm like, okay, just one at a time, because that's what I can hold in mind and work with. But also, we all have differing baths of neurochemicals. Some people have sort of a neural bath that helps them hold those dendritic spines, which are connecting neurons together, and that's at the heart of our ability to remember. Some of them have a neural bath that fixes those spines in place really well, and they have a superb memory. They can't, they don't forget things. I wish I had that kind of memory. But again, there's a disadvantage with that kind of memory. If that spine sticks there, doesn't fall away, it also means you're less flexible in your thinking. And indeed, there is evidence that really smart individuals can tend to jump to conclusions. And when they're wrong, they just can't change their minds.
That's an important distinction and an advantage of having that hiker brain so that people can realize that even if they don't have the genetic gifts of some, it doesn't mean they can't learn or be effective or be successful in their career, which you have some great examples in your books of slow thinkers that did some amazing things. So getting to memory, because I think memory gets kind of the wrong, many people don't understand memory very well. And you mentioned that the real challenge with memory isn't storage, but accessing the information. And working memory is misleading because it causes us to be overconfident about what we know when we really don't know it. It's just being held in working memory. It's not being transferred into long-term memory.
I know a fair bit about learning. And even with all my knowledge, I can be looking at a research paper and I will say, I've got it up here. I know it. No way is that, not in my long-term memory. I've got it. And the next day it is gone. It's because when you are looking at something, you are actually, you're getting that vision, you see it, but it is not in your memory. It's just in the visual representations that are coming in on your eye. And you cannot tell the difference when it is just sitting there in your temporary working memory, just sparked by your visual field. You can't tell the difference between that and whether it is in your long term memory. You can only tell the difference when you close your eyes, look away, see if you can remember it. And even better yet, see if you can remember it the next day.
And that's so critical when studying anything. A lot of people, like what you just mentioned, they reread the material. They don't try to actively recall things. And that's really one of the best practices you can employ to see if it got into your long-term memory is that active recall, looking away and trying to remember what was on the notes, what was on that page, that chapter of the book, because that really is probably the best test of whether or not you've consolidated the information enough and whether it's entering into long-term memory, correct?
Bingo, you've nailed it.
So let's move into some of the learning strategies because I think a lot of people are operating once again with outdated learning strategies. One great learning strategy we just talked about, active recall. It's so important to do that instead of rereading notes, highlighting, underlining. Perhaps you can just give some insight into why those strategies aren't that effective, that being highlighting, rereading, or just kind of perusing the notes or problems that you see on the page.
Let's say that I'm trying to memorize a vocabulary word in a foreign language. If I look at that word on a page, I can virtually guarantee you that when I am actually staring at some native speaker and I'm trying to pull that word to mind a week later, I will have no idea what that word was. I can use Google Translate to translate into pick your name, pick whatever language you want. And I can look like I really know what I'm doing when I'm speaking Mongolian. because I'm looking exactly. In fact, I can have it reading for me in a very good Mongolian accent. But it's not, but me being able to speak Mongolian means that I have to have those engrams, those connections between neurons that are at the heart of a memory. And it has to be in my own mind. And the only way to get that into your mind is not to just sit there and look at a word. That's not going to put that memory. You have to close your eyes and see if you can remember that word from your own mind. So people will sometimes say, well, wait a minute. Retrieval practice is not as good as teaching somebody, but teaching somebody is using retrieval practice. You're pulling it from your own mind as you're standing in front of people. You can always tell when people have training from professional development in how to teach. Because if you ask them, what is the best way for people to learn, whether it's rereading, underlining, using retrieval practice like flashcards or concept mapping, they'll all raise their hands. It's concept mapping. But the reality is, concept mapping is, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a little like note taking. Would you say that note taking is the best way for people to learn the material? No, you've got to study the notes that you take. It's what you do with the notes. Do you write little questions and quiz yourself and see if you've got the same, those key ideas? Writing down key concepts and circling those key concepts, it's not pulling those ideas from your own mind, especially if you're just looking at the book when you're doing that. It's, in essence, kind of like a form of note taking, at least by my way of thinking. But there are hundreds and hundreds of research articles that show by far retrieval practice is the best way, far better than, you draw a line to underline something. You're moving a pen on the page. You think it's going into your brain, but it's not. You're just moving the pen on the page. People will sometimes make the mistake of thinking, oh, retrieval practice, it's just for simplistic rote facts, like what was the date of the French Revolution? But it's not. It's all in what type of retrieval practice question you are asking yourself. So, for example, if you ask yourself a higher level Bloom's taxonomy question like compare and contrast the French and the Russian revolutions, that's a really high level. And retrieval practice indeed has been found to deepen conceptual understanding as well as memory.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.